like also last year, we had a special visitor, Suhotra Swami, who is traveling all around. He's now on the Scandinavian part of his tour, visiting different universities, 6 universities in Finland, and visiting about 30 different countries, part of the year in India, and this part of the year all around. So Maharaj is well known. Many books he has been written. Substance and Shadow, you may have seen in the field of Substance and Shadow, the Vedic method for knowledge. Then there is Dimension of Good and Evil, Transcendental Personalism, and a few others. Now the upcoming one is called Vedanta Psychology. He's also one of the spiritual masters in ISKCON. So on behalf of this staff, some of you are students of Professor Hannu Soini. Everyone is welcome, specifically directed to those who are teachers of psychology. And it will be about an hour like that, and then for your questions, about half an hour. So we'd like to welcome, and specifically I think we'd like to welcome, he made a big effort. He was just flying from Copenhagen, and if I show you his travel map, you will be quite surprised. From here to tomorrow to Vaasa, to Helsinki, to Amsterdam, to New Zealand, to India. So we'd like to welcome. This is the Northern, and I would like to say one of the best in Finland, because I myself have been lecturing for the last 14 years in different colleges and universities. Without on the talk, we'd like to welcome Suhotra Swami.
When you start, I would like to ask, how many of you are in psychology? Students? Because this is our subject, Vedanta psychology. So of course, as Prabhupada mentioned, this is for everyone. Everyone is interested in the mind. But I think if you're a student of psychology and you have looked at the theories of the mind that come from different schools of psychology, I understand there are at least 6 or 8 main schools of psychology in the West, if not more. And of course they explain the mind in different ways. So you can compare what you learned in your studies to what I'm presenting today. And this model or schema of the mind comes from Vedanta. I need to explain that word. It's actually a composite of 2 words. Veda in Sanskrit means knowledge. I see here in Finland it means to pull the door open. Is that right? Veda, I saw on the door. So that's a little bit different. But in Sanskrit it means knowledge, and the root is actually vid. And from this word vid, we see cognates, they're called. We see derived words in different European languages. Like in English we have wisdom, or we have video, to see, or idea, which comes from Greek. But this vid root is evident. In German, wissen. In Czech also they have the same word Veda for science. So that's Veda, knowledge. And in particular, there is a great collection of texts in the Sanskrit language, very ancient, which are known together as the Veda. And it's this encyclopedia of ancient wisdom, which is the foundation of traditional Indian society, going back thousands of years. And the other word is anta, and you can immediately see the similarity to the English word, which is the translation for anta, end, So it means end or conclusion, or the point. So Vedanta presents us the point or conclusion of all of this knowledge, which, as I said, is many texts. Literally hundreds and hundreds of different texts on many different subject matters. Take more than a lifetime to go through them all and study them carefully. So naturally, if one is interested to know this transcendental knowledge, one would like to find out what the point of it all is. So that's what Vedanta is all about. And there are certain, among the Vedic scriptures, there are certain scriptures which are called Vedanta scriptures. One of them is the Bhagavad Gita. You may have heard of that. That's quite well known. Spoken by Krishna to Arjuna. There is another, it's a collection called the Upanishads, philosophical texts. And there's a third, the Vedanta Sutra. And then there's a natural commentary called Srimad Bhagavatam. So these are examples of different Vedanta texts. And there are many more than that. A lot of commentaries have been written. And there's always debates on Vedanta between different schools. So in this way, Vedanta today in India is still very much alive. Although much of that traditional Vedic culture is not so present now because India has become rather modernized and westernized. But still, intellectually, philosophically, the Vedanta is very important in India. And so out of this Vedanta, the philosophy of the Vedas, we derive a schema of the mind. And by presenting this to you, just by presenting this, you will be able to understand, as I go through it, practically, in essence, the Vedanta philosophy too. Because this schema of the mind is coming within a total worldview. And actually the mind is very important in this Vedantic worldview. Because, why? Because in Vedanta, the actual substratum, you say the ground of being, the reality on which we all exist. According to Vedanta philosophy, it is not matter, which I think is more the prominent idea in the West. Western philosophy, science especially, tends to be materialistic, tends to reduce everything down to matter, to atoms and protons and electrons and all of that, quantum physics. But in Vedanta, the ground of being, the ultimate reality, is consciousness. And consciousness actually exists independent of matter, and in fact is quite an opposite conception. I mean, in the West, the general picture is first you have matter and consciousness comes out of matter. But in Vedanta, it's exactly the opposite. First there's consciousness and matter comes out of consciousness. So that may be a bit, a bit of a tall order for some of you. But at least we can say one thing. One thing is obvious. That in our life, in our basic experience of life, the fundamental thing is consciousness. I mean, if we didn't have consciousness, we couldn't talk about anything. We couldn't talk about matter. We wouldn't know what matter is. We wouldn't know anything. Our science, all of that, which may claim that everything is really matter, it wouldn't mean anything to us if we weren't conscious of it. So as far as our practical life goes, consciousness is foremost. So, but this is not naive, because you can say, well, obviously consciousness is situated in the brain, and that the brain is hurt or injured, then consciousness is affected or doesn't seem to manifest. Well, I'll explain why that is as I go through this. This is not naive. This is not just childish. That we're aware of consciousness before anything else, so therefore everything is founded on consciousness. It's not that simple. This is quite sophisticated philosophy. So let me get into it. So, first of all, in talking about the mind, we are talking about an entity known in Sanskrit as Jiva Bhuta, which means embodied soul. So the soul, or Atma, Jiva Atma, is the essence of the self. When we talk about I or me, ultimately we're referring to that soul, which is certainly beyond the body, and is even beyond the mind, because the mind is a condition of consciousness. So the source of consciousness is this embodied soul. And the soul, again, like I said, consciousness is independent of matter. So that is the soul. The soul is actually independent of this body. The soul is residing in the body, giving it life. But when the body is no longer workable, the soul will move on. This is according to Vedanta. The soul is going to move on and take another body. It may be another human body, or if the karma, which I'm going to explain more, the karma is not so good, then the soul may go downward into a lower body, animal, plant, fish, something like that. There are also higher bodies than human beings. The soul can enter them, superior beings on other planets. And the soul can be liberated entirely, leave this material realm entirely, not take a material body, but rather become manifest in its own spiritual nature in the realm of pure consciousness, which is called in Vedanta Brahman. Brahman, the absolute truth. So the soul is actually a tiny part of that Brahman. Like the sun is shining, well, not so much today, but on a nice day, the sun is shining and spreading its rays everywhere. And science tells us that the rays of the sun are made up of photons, individual units of light. So something like that. There's a Param Brahman, a supreme consciousness. The rays of Brahman spread out from it. And within those rays of pure consciousness, there are individual units, which are the souls. So some of these souls, just like today, it's a cloudy day. So the light is covered by cloud or darkness. So some of these souls enter into a kind of darkness called avidya, ignorance. That means they become ignorant of themselves as spiritual beings. Their consciousness is conditioned by this ignorance. And that conditioning of consciousness manifests as what we know as the mind. So the mind or conditioned consciousness is discussed in two parts. Here, Linga Sharira, this is Sanskrit. We can translate that as the subtle body of mental awareness, our conscious mind. And then there's the Karana Sharira, or subconscious mind. Now you see, this is coming from thousands of years ago, but it's quite sophisticated. They were teaching about conscious mind and subconscious mind. So I'll just go on with the explanation. So you'll find out what is the difference between the two. So the conscious mind, that is the field in which we have our perceptions and our thoughts. Actually, it's triangular. It can be diagrammed as a triangle. We have here on this corner T for thinking, cognitive, the cognitive function of the mind. And at the top of the triangle, F for feeling, the affective function of the mind, it's called in modern psychology, the emotions. And then here, W for willing or acting, or in English language and psychology, the term is the cognitive function of the mind. So, yes, this is what's going on in the mind. This is what we're aware of, readily aware of. Our thoughts, our emotions, and what we want to do, our activities. So, also, embedded in this mind, or part of this mind, are what are known as buddhi and ahankara. These are Sanskrit words, I need to explain them. Buddhi means intelligence. Now this is an interesting discussion. What is the difference between mind and intelligence? From what I've seen in the West, that's a little hazy. People generally tend to mix the two. But in Vedanta philosophy, there's a clear difference between mind and intelligence. Intelligence is a higher direction, a higher source of direction that the mind relies on. It is something like the program of a computer. You see, there's a program in it. When you look at the computer, you're dealing with the external features of the program. You're seeing some nice graphics on the screen. There are certain commands that you type in. You work the program that way. But the program, obviously, is something much more than what you see. And it's giving direction to what happens. When you press a keyboard, there's something going on inside which causes, in the graphics display, something to happen that you want. So this is the intelligence. And the intelligence is very much connected with memory. Intelligence and memory, they're very closely associated. Because the memory is a storehouse. And based on that storehouse, the intelligence is giving direction. So also there's ahankara, which means false identity or false ego. Because as I said, the soul is in ignorance. The soul is no longer identifying itself as being eternal spirit. It's identifying with matter. And thinking itself to be the body and the mind. Actually, when we talk of the mind, we're talking about a subtle body. There's a subtle body. Sometimes in the West it's called the astral body. And then there's the gross physical body, this body that we can see. So the mind is also, just like you wear overclothes and underclothes. So it's something like that. So the ahankara is that very principle of strong identity with this body. And because the soul becomes so much captured by the ahankara, that's why we see this this consciousness seems to depend on the brain. You see, if certain chemicals are introduced into the brain, then consciousness seems to change. We become unconscious. So, therefore, people think that consciousness depends on matter. But the Vedanta says, no, a consciousness is attached to matter. It is clinging very strongly to matter, and because of clinging so strongly, therefore it is affected by matter. But matter is not the cause of consciousness. You see, consciousness is actually independent, but has surrendered itself to matter. So, intelligence, ahankara, and then the field of the mind. And I want to now go through these three corners. So, thinking or cognition, it entails perception, in Sanskrit, pratyaksha, to perceive things. And how do we perceive things? We perceive things through the senses, obviously. Our eyes are perceiving, but our ears are too. Nose and tongue and sense of taste. These are all flooding our mind with perceptions right now. You see? That place where all these perceptions are coming together is the mind. That's how you can know immediately what the mind is. It's where all these perceptions come together and we form our picture of the world. So, senses, but then also we perceive through logic. In Sanskrit, tarka or anuma. So, how does this work that we can perceive by logic? Well, science is largely based on that principle. There are many, many things in science which are accepted as fact that are not seen directly. But they're accepted as fact because, why? Because they're logical. They're logical, and the logic seems to work. If you use this logic, you get a result that indicates that this unseen entity is actually there. Just like I mentioned, I was talking about matter, this Western scientific investigation of matter. So you have these particles with names, you've all heard them, electron, and proton, and neutron, and then there's things like quarks, and gluons, and muons, and a whole menagerie of what are called subatomic particles. In fact, no one has ever seen them, nor can they be seen. It's impossible to see them. Why is that? Because they're far, far smaller than the wavelength of light. So what comes to our eyes is carried by waves of light. So something smaller, a wave of light is very small, but something that is smaller than a wave of light is invisible to us. So these things have never been seen. And as a matter of fact, I was just in Turku a while ago, and I was talking with a quantum physicist there. And he was saying, even in the laboratory, where they're using sophisticated instruments to detect these particles, even there, you see, you're getting a reading on an instrument that's telling you there's been some jump in energy. And then they call that an electron. You see, it's a name they put on this type of... But even the instrument is not showing you really what an electron is. That's up here. You see, that's an idea that we have. You see, people think of these electrons maybe as tiny little balls whizzing around. But in quantum physics, they even tell you that won't work to think of electrons. Actually, in quantum physics, they can't really say what an electron is. It is really just an idea. But something is being registered on an instrument or in a cloud chamber. So they have this name for it. So you see, this is logic. This is logic. Something is happening, so something must be there. So we'll call it an electron, and we can work with these electrons. Therefore, we have electricity. You see, we can do things with it, so it must be right. Although no one has ever seen it. You see, or that was a quite sophisticated example, perhaps, but simple example is if you're sitting here and a familiar voice to you, the voice of a friend, calls to you through the door, through the closed door, calls your name. So you have every right, as we say, in your mind's eye, to think of your friend as standing on the other side of the door. You see, you don't see him with your eyes, but it's obvious he must be there. That's logic. Now it could be, you could go and open the door, and somebody else is there with a tape player with your friend's voice on it. That could be too. He might not be there, you see, because therefore, there are problems with logic like that. But in general experience, we use logic also to perceive things. So the senses and our logic, and then there's another means of perception, which is called in Sanskrit Dibya Pratyaksha, divine perception, or Shakshi, the inner witness, and in English language we call this intuition. Intuition is, how do you put your finger on it? We say it's a feeling, but it's not an emotional feeling. It's a perceptual feeling. You see, and this is also very real. This is not imaginary. I know, not from my personal experience, but I have known persons who have served in these special forces, military units. And one of the things they learn, because they learn this type of sneaking up on the enemy outpost very carefully so that they won't be detected with all their camouflage and their paint on their face. They learn how to do these things. And one of the techniques that is drilled into them is that if you're sneaking up on someone, say a guard, an enemy guard, and he has his back to you, even he has his back to you, you should never look at him directly with your eyes. You should always look to one side. Because if you look direct, his intuition will catch you. You see, he'll feel it and turn. And it happens so many times. Maybe not everybody is so sensitive, but it's common enough where in these special forces, this is a rule. Never look at them directly. Always have your eyes off to one side. See them through what's called peripheral vision, side vision. And that's much harder to feel. So this is intuition, one example. And sometimes intuition extends into the psychic realm. You see, sometimes people have what are called precognitive dreams. They can dream. I'm going to talk about dreams in a moment, but this is a little preview. So some people have had dreams of the future, and they've actually turned out to be true. I know a case that has been substantiated in big newspapers and news magazines, investigated and substantiated that actually happened. And this was, there was an airplane crash in Chicago, I think in 1979, maybe 78. And, but before that, for I think weeks before that, that airport was getting phone calls, regular phone calls, not just one, as I should say repeated phone calls, not just one phone call. A man kept having a dream, night after night after night, and he kept calling. The dream was so real to him. He was so alarmed, he called the airport several times and said, I see from the Chicago O'Hare Airport a 3-engine jet airliner taking off, and then while it's still above the runway, it turns upside down and falls and explodes in a big fireball. I keep having this dream. And of course, the police came and investigated, because they investigate things like that. If someone keeps calling, maybe he's some kind of nut, maybe he'll plan a bomb on the plane to make it actually happen. So they investigated, they found he's just an innocent person. But he kept having this dream and kept reporting it. And then after some time, this thing that he foresaw actually happened. And the parents of one of our members of the Hare Krishna movement they were on that plane and killed in the crash. That's why I know it actually happened. So that crash happened just as he saw it. It was a 3-motor plane. It took off, turned upside down, fell, and exploded. So these things are recorded, precognitive dreams. And this is the intuition. The intuition comes up into the mind during the dream state or when we're awake. And it gives us it's a kind of, yes, a special insight into things, into people too. Sometimes you meet a person, and from the way he looks and acts, you have no reason to judge him as being someone you can't trust. You just feel it. And therefore you don't want to get close to this person. Something about him, you don't know what it is really. So this is intuition. So these are all parts, these are all aspects of what we call perception. And yes, I wanted to talk about, as I said, dreams, because dreams are happening in this cognitive part of the mind, but they happen when the senses are shut down. At night, when we sleep, then the senses are closed. Our eyes are closed, but our senses are not involved with the external world. But when you have dreams, you see, you experience sense perception. You experience perception. You see things, and you move around. You pick up objects, you see. So where is that coming from? That's coming from the memory. Now, on this point, I'll introduce another important item, and this is Paramatma. There's Jivatma, the individual soul, the essence of our self, but also with the Jivatma there's what's called Paramatma, the supreme soul. And that is the supreme conscious being, or God, which is expanded everywhere, into everyone and everything, all pervading. This Paramatma is also known by the name Vishnu. Vishnu in Sanskrit means he who lives everywhere. So the Paramatma is also with us as the ultimate witness. And that's taught in many religions, that God is the witness. They say God is watching you. So Vedanta teaches, yes, God is watching you. God is watching you from within. Because your consciousness is also an emanation from God, from God's consciousness, who is there, localized in the body, in a localized form as the Paramatma. And from Paramatma, he is the source of, this is drawn from the Bhagavad Gita, he is the source of our knowledge, the type of knowledge that we have, because in different cultures there can be very different types of knowledge, very different ways of looking at the world. Anthropologists study this. They'll go to the jungles of South America or jungles of Africa and meet these indigenous people there and find out how they see the world. They see the world much differently than we do. You see, they have a whole different conception of what's going on. And so these different types of knowledge that we have for our use, this is supplied by Paramatma according to our desires and according to our karma. I'll explain that more later. So knowledge and remembrance, our power to remember things, and forgetfulness, what we forget, and often we want to forget things, so he helps us with that. He is the overseer, the witness of everything, the permitter. He permits our activities, he permits every action that we do, he gives energy for it, or he may not permit that we can do a thing. And he is what we call the conscience. You know, consciousness means awareness, but conscience means that an inner, shall we say, like a judge inside. When we do good things, do a good deed, help someone who needs help, then we get a kind of maybe warm glow inside, a kind of confirmation that was nice. And when we do a bad thing, when we are cruel to someone, insult them, hurt them, then we feel something. I mean, unless one is a very hard-hearted, we have this term psychopath for people who have no empathy for other people. So unless we're one of those kind of people, and most people feel, even though they may speak badly to someone, harshly, they feel some twinge of remorse inside. And that may even impel them to apologize. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Please forgive me. So this is conscience. And the Paramatma is the Antaryami also. Antaryami means the inner ruler. So in this body there are such incredibly sophisticated systems, like the nervous system, the digestive system, all of these different organs. And when we examine them, they're incredibly complex. You can read in science texts, it's very common, where they'll say, even one cell of the body, when you look at one cell of the body under a powerful microscope, it's like looking at a whole planet in a telescope. It is so complex. So I was seeing an animation recently of a neuron. Neuron is a nerve cell. And it's incredibly complex what goes on in neurons, the transmission of nervous energy along the nervous system. Incredibly, neurotransmission it's called. Incredibly complex things going on. And very, very, very small. So, the Antaryami, or inner ruler, is supervising all of this. See, our heart is beating every moment. People like to think, I am the body, I'm the controller of the body. But actually, if the full control of this body was turned over to you, let's say, somehow it would be possible that you could go to a window and request, I want to take full control of this body. And you'd really have your hands full. See, because you'd have to, okay, heart beat. You see, now beat again, you see. And you'd have to instruct your stomach how to digest food. You have to make sure the blood is pumping every. You see, And the human mind wouldn't be able to take care of it all. You see, we'd be in real trouble. So this is what I mean. There is another consciousness in the body that is supervising all that, and that is the Paramatma. So this memory, the Paramatma is storing the memory for us, and he gives it. So this is what we're experiencing in dreams. We're interacting with the memory. And anyway, it would be a good point to go down to the subconscious mind, but I'll wait. I want to get this done. Because subconscious, when the subject of memory comes up, then subconscious becomes a logical thing to talk about. But let me just move on. So we've spoken about the perceptive part, the cognitive part of the mind, thinking part of the mind, and discrimination. This is important. Right discrimination. This is an important quality that we need. So Vedanta is teaching a yoga system. Yoga is a kind of spiritual discipline. And by this discipline, one is supposed to live his life in such a way to ultimately benefit this soul. You see, living in the body, living out the life in this body, but so that the soul will achieve, I told you about this liberation of the soul from the cycle of birth and death. So, to live our life properly requires the quality of discrimination. And that is acquired. That is, of course, there's some primitive discrimination that we're born with, but it has to be developed. And that's why there's education. That's basically what we're here, what you go to school to learn. Basically, in different fields, is discrimination. What does it mean? It means to tell right from wrong, truth from false, what is and what isn't. That's basically what you're doing in school, in these like history or science or this or that. Basically, what you're learning, what real history is, what actually happened in the past. That's what they're trying to teach you. And then they will tell you also what didn't happen. So this is called discrimination. This is very, very important in our cognitive life to have good discrimination. Otherwise we become, you see, bewildered. If you don't know what is wrong, what is right, what is real, what is illusion, then you get all mixed up and you can make very serious mistakes. So let's go up to feeling. The feeling or affective part of the mind. From this word affective, there's the word affection. Affection means to have feelings for another person. So we have many emotions, and some are positive, some are negative. So I'm not going to list all the emotions. There are many I could, in the Vedanta literature, there are long lists of different kinds of emotions. But what I want to say is that just like I mentioned discrimination, so in feelings too, there are certain feelings that Vedanta says should be cultivated, that should be made very strong and prominent over all other emotions. And the first and foremost is love. And this means actually a selfless love. Ultimately a love for God. A love for God, as I said, Paramatma, Vishnu, Krishna. He is all-pervading. So loving God means to also love everything in His creation. And another very excellent quality is mercy, to be merciful to others, sympathetic to others, well-wishing, to want the good for everyone, non-violence, not to be violent. Non-violence, ahimsa in Sanskrit, means as little violence as possible. The nature of this world is that there's always some violence. It's unavoidable. But the value system is to live as much as possible without it. So these are considered exalted emotions which benefit the spiritual progress of the soul are beneficial for the whole human society. So our mind is actually ruled by our feelings. This is very important. Of these three, thinking, feeling, willing, the strongest corner is in the feelings. The feelings rule what we think, and the feelings rule our activities. You see? This is very interesting and very true if you study the psychology of people. Even so-called great intellectuals, people who are supposed to be very rational. What if you look at, for reasons, why they believe what they believe, why they argue as they do, you see, using all their reason, you'll find that there's some emotional, you see, reason. The reason is actually emotional. Just like in political debates, you have the left wing and you have the right wing. And these are actually emotional values. They're sort of like almost instinctive values that people gravitate to. And then they use their cognitive mind, their intellect and so on to argue on the basis of these emotions. Then willing. Willing means the use of our, what in Sanskrit is called karmendriya, or cognitive senses, active senses, like the hand and the leg. We use these to perform work. So, a quality very important in our willing, in our action, is honesty. And this is stressed in Vedanta. So this is the idea that here we have the conscious mind, and these qualities, when they're introduced in the mind, they make us better people. And then, that was the conscious mind. Then, underneath, you have what's called the karana sharira, causal body, the subconscious mind. And this is actually the greater part of the mind. You can think of an iceberg. So, as big as the iceberg might be, that's only 1/8 of what is there. You see, another 7/8 is below the surface. So, the soul, you see, that eternal soul, in our conscious mind, we're hardly aware of ourselves as soul, unless we have taken a discipline like this and learned it very well and gotten some realizations from it. But generally, people, it's an idea. Oh, it's an interesting idea. Yes, I may be an eternal soul, but I'm not sure of that. So then the question always is, so if we really are an eternal soul, if that's what we really are, then where is it? You see? Where is it? So this is where it is. It's down. Of course, it's also there. This is one small portion of our consciousness, the conscious mind. But most of it is down here, covered by the subconsciousness, which is avidya. Avidya, ignorance. It is that ignorance of ourself. If all of this could be uncovered, conscious mind, unconscious mind, then the soul would be revealed. So, in the subconscious mind, we have what in Sanskrit are called vasanas. These are the deep storehouse of desires. I mentioned mind, buddhi, ahankara. So it's in the mind where the desires are, particularly in the subconscious mind. We don't have desires in our intellect or in our ego, but desires are mainly in the lower part of the mind, and they come up. They pour into the mind from underneath different desires. And they take control of the mind. You see, the desires pour in, and the mind seizes on them, becomes attached to them. And as it becomes attached to them, it's going through this thinking, feeling, and then willing. This is the basic movement of psychology. A vasana or desire pours into the mind, we become aware of it in our thoughts, that, oh, this is an interesting thing, this is an interesting idea, and then we contemplate it, we think about it more, and it becomes a feeling, it becomes something that we want, something that we really would like to have. The emotions become aroused. And then finally, when that reaches a kind of high point, then we have to act on that feeling. We have to go out and do something. You see, this is seen in the attraction between men and women very clearly. A young man sees a cute girl and thinks that's nice, and he's thinking, as he's looking at her, thinking about it, then emotions become aroused. She's very attractive, and then finally he has to just go over and say, hello, my name is such and such. So this is, or hunger, you see, or attraction to eat certain foods. It follows this. Thinking, feeling, willing. Coming up into the mind as desire, vasana. So now these vasanas, they're actually very, very deep in the consciousness, going right to the core of the consciousness, because these desires are ultimately the very need of the soul. What the soul wants, according to Vedanta, is ananda. Ananda means bliss. Ananda means a kind of all-fulfilling happiness. This is what we really need. So when we're in ignorance, that need comes out as different, what we know as vasanas or material desires. We transfer that need to the material world, and we think we can become satisfied by enjoying different material things. But Vedanta teaches us you won't be satisfied, because they are material and you are spiritual. They are temporary, those things, and you are eternal. So a temporary thing cannot satisfy an eternal entity. The entity has to be satisfied by something that is also eternal. There has to be an eternal relationship. And that eternal entity is the Paramatma, is actually God himself. He's known as the Anandamaya Purusha. That's a person that is full of ananda or bliss. So this love I was talking about, which is the supreme emotion, should be transferred to Paramatma. And this is done by a process known as bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And when we enter into that loving relationship with Paramatma, then these vasanas, these desires, are purified. They're purified, and one is no longer pushed by these many desires into different material activities. Also down in the subconsciousness, there's the samskaras. They're very closely related, these two. Sometimes they're even put together as one thing. But samskaras, this word samskara means impression. So we have impressions from our past experience, which are stored in the deep memory of the subconscious. And these impressions even go back to previous lifetimes. So therefore you have today a type of therapy called regressive therapy, whereby hypnotism, the therapist tries to take the patient back into previous lifetimes. I'm not going to advocate this, but I know it is quite much practiced nowadays. In fact, I have a friend who does such therapy, a couple of friends who do such therapy in Sweden. I'm a little skeptical of that therapy, by the way. Although, this is my philosophy, obviously. But why am I skeptical of it? Because the hypnotism, the hypnotic state, what do they say about it? They say it's a dream state. You go into a dream while you're awake. So the mind is in a dream state. And in the dream state, the mind makes associations. The mind makes, this is what's going on. We're taking memories in our dream and associating them together. That's why dreams are often very far out, because wild things are combined together, wild different experiences. They're drawn from the memory and just put together in different ways. So we make associations. So if the mind is in that state, making associations, and the therapist is saying, go into your next life, And remember where you don't know what the mind will associate with that instruction. You see, go into the past life means that the mind might draw from the memory some images from a history school book. You see pictures of Egypt that you saw, ancient Egypt that you saw when you were a kid. And the mind might put them up and make them look very real. And then you say, oh yes, I'm in Egypt now, you see. And the therapist says, oh good, good. So in your past life you were in Egypt. But this has happened. These things have been, I know of a case where a young woman, no, she was a grown woman, but she was asked to go in a past life. And she was seeing herself as a little girl in France in the 1700s. And she even recited a poem in 17th century French, but she was not a French woman, she was English, I think English. And her language was English, she didn't know any French. So everyone was amazed, oh, she's speaking 17th century French. That proves that she was living in a previous life in France. But then later, she went up to her attic, and she was looking in some old boxes, and she found a book that she had read as a little girl, a book about 17th century France, and that poem was there. And as a little girl, she read the poem a few times, and it stuck deep in her memory. And it came up in the hypnotic session. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of regressive therapy. Because I think if you put the mind in the dream state, you have no control over what it's doing. You can't guarantee that you're actually getting memories from a previous life. And these past life memories are actually very, very deeply buried. But still they act upon us in subtle ways. So this is called samskaras. And we can associate experiences in this life with things that we've experienced in past lives. That sometimes seems to happen. There's often talk in psychological circles about this phenomena. It has a French name, déjà vu, where you can't explain how, but you really feel, you go somewhere and you feel you were there before. It's just a very striking familiarity. So that could be, I'm not saying in every case that's what it is, but that could be such a kind of association. Like a present experience with something we have experienced in the past. In a past life, previous life. So these two are there. And they are coming along with the vasanas into the mind in the form of desires and urges and instincts and so on and so forth. All these things coming up from the basement of the mind. So, then the result of all this in the material world, out of this subconscious mind, these vasanas and samskaras, they embed themselves in our conscious mind, in our awareness, as bija. Bija means seed. Seed of karma. Karma means our activities. We carry out, again, activities here with the willing part of our mind. So they get in as bija, karma bija, seed of activity. And these gradually mature. The second stage, papa. Papa means an act which will give a karmic reaction. We do something which is going to force us to experience a result, a reaction in the future. And this is the logic of rebirth, reincarnation. That what we do in this life, it doesn't end with this life. But as we're acting in this life, we're actually creating, subtly, we're creating our next body. You see? So, papa, that's the next thing. An actual act. And this act, then the first reaction that comes are subtle. They're all in the mind. You see, just like if one does a crime, if one breaks the law, and he doesn't get a physical reaction yet, or it may not even come in this life. He may get away with it, or may not. But there's a period after he's done it. He's not been caught yet, but he's suffering reactions. He's scared. You see, he's done something, He thought no one would know about it, but the next day it's all in the newspaper. And police are investigating. He becomes very worried. You know, he's looking out his window, and the phone rings, and he's scared. And so these are subtle reactions already appearing in the mind to bad things we have done. Or they're not only bad things, they can be good things we did. And there's also reactions to those, good feelings that come in the mind. And then if we collect these subtle reactions to our activities in our mind. They collect in the mind and they form, in Sanskrit, called kutta. So I've translated that as attitude. There's another word, propensity, but that's a pretty big word. Proclivity, that's another big word. So more simple is to say attitude. It's kind of attitude we have. Like, a person, this is logical. A person who acts out a lot of sports vijas, the impulse, let us say, the impulse to do sports, to play football, to jog, to climb mountains, this kind of thing. So and he performs these activities, and he gets reactions in the mind from them, and then this creates an attitude. So you have that kind of sporting attitude. He has a whole attitude. He's adventurous. He likes to go out and meet a challenge. He likes to be very active and accomplish big things. It's kind of a sportsman attitude, which comes from repeatedly doing sportsman-like activities. Or playing music. You see, one becomes a musician playing guitar. Well, there's a whole attitude. Everyone knows. There's a whole attitude if one becomes a professional musician and guitarist. You see, it's not just playing, but there's a whole mentality that comes with it. So, as I say, this forms a kind of, let us say, professional image of ourselves, what we do. And then from coming out of this cycle, which is subtle, more or less mental, then we get karmic reactions to what we've done. We have to take, ultimately it means take another body, according to what we've done. So, this is what turns, in other words, this is what is turning the cycle of reincarnation, the cycle of birth and death, is this. Coming out of the subconscious, there's these vasanas and samskaras, which appear in us, in our consciousness as bija or impulses, and we have to act on them, and when we do act on them, we get subtle reactions, attitude, and finally karma. So, the wheel of karma just keeps turning and turning and turning, so long as we don't have real control over this system. You see, if things are just pouring into the mind from underneath and we have no control over it, then we're just following our urges. And so in this way, one goes on and on and on in life, getting different bodies according to the urges that we've acted upon. So Vedanta is teaching all of this. The whole point of this psychological schema is to train us to take command over our mind, both the conscious and subconscious. And taking command really means that we surrender the mind to the Paramatma, to Vishnu, to Krishna, and let Him purify it and govern it spiritually, rule it spiritually. Because the relationship between the Atma and Paramatma, the Paramatma is allowing the Atma has power of choice. He can choose either to be godly minded or to be godless minded. And so when he's godless minded, then because he wants to act on his own desires, then this is what is happening. All right, let the desires come and you take care of them. And this way we get karma. So, many people are happy with that, just go on in life. So then birth, death, disease, old age, on and on and on. But if one starts to think, well, this is not a very good future for me, that everything I work for, everything I think that I should have in life is ultimately taken away from me by time, even this body which I identify with, that will also be removed, and I'll take another body. I have no control over how that's happening. So one may then want to be released from that and attain this sublime God consciousness. So that means this whole apparatus of the subtle mind has to become flooded with divine knowledge, so that the ignorance is removed and we see ourselves as pure spirit soul, and we see our eternal relationship with Paramatma Sri Vishnu, Lord Krishna. So this, what I've just described, this process, yes, that is the Bhakti Yoga process, the yoga of devotion, which is taught in scriptures like Bhagavad Gita. And I've already mentioned, by that process then we are able to experience this unending ananda, spiritual bliss, which fully satisfies the soul. So, I want to stop here, because I think I've given you a lot of information to digest, and there's a lot in this that you may have questions about, that we may have to discuss further. So I'll stop here and see if you have anything to say. And if you do, then I can comment a little more. Any questions? Yes.
According to this model, is the soul equal to the mind? Or is it
That the soul and the mind are different. One thing, there is a pure mind or spiritual mind. What is that? Because the soul is the seat of the self. The soul is the self. But the energy of the soul, or light of the soul, is knowledge or awareness or consciousness. So that pure original consciousness of the soul, that is our pure mind. But what we call the material mind or the phenomenal mind, which is what this diagram is about, I already explained. That is the consciousness of the soul submerged in ignorance. Now, I didn't say much about the ignorance. I could say more about that. That in the material world there are what's called different modes of nature, different ways in which nature works. And the basic mode is ignorance. In other words, we have to be forgetful of our spiritual self in order to come into this material world. And there's also a mode of passion. This is the mode of activity. And then there's a mode of goodness. This is a mode of peace and detachment and enlightenment. Goodness. So these are three states of material existence. So these are experienced in the mind. That describes our different mental states. Sometimes we feel very peaceful, very satisfied inside, and then we become impelled to do activity. So we go from goodness to passion. And then after doing a lot of activity, for example, then we have to go to sleep. Sleep is an example of ignorance. That's just one example. But in general, we are in ignorance all the time because we are ignorant of this greater part of our consciousness. Our actual self as soul is submerged in ignorance. Yes, so this is what we call the material mind, all these things. And that is different from the soul. That is the ignorance of the soul. Anything else?
There are doubts in the heart about worship Krishna consciousness. So what to do with the doubts?
Doubts. That's an interesting question. Yes. Doubts are spots. They're spots in knowledge. Just like there are spots on the sun. So doubts are spots on our knowledge. And they have to be removed. So they're removed by, in this context, in Vedanta, one puts questions before the guru, the spiritual master. The questions are enunciating the doubts, the dark places in our understanding. And the guru gives light, knowledge, and they are removed.
Voitte tehdä suomeksi voidaan käyttäisi.
According to your story with the app, according to your story with the airplane, do you personally think future is determined?
Future is what?
Determined.
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 Well, karma extends into the future, you see? And we are creating our future in the present. So the future is there. But you ask if it is determined. So, in the theory of determinism, there's no independence. So that doesn't really fit into this idea of karma, this explanation of karma. Because karma is based on will. So will means choice. So we are creating the circumstances of our future by what we do now. But as soul, we always have the power of choice. Now we may be in a situation, we may end up in some situation where it's quite difficult to exercise that power of choice. But still the power is there. For example, if one just, let's never mind about the future, but suppose one does something in this life where one has to be punished for it, is sent to prison. So one's locked up in the prison cell. So he doesn't have much choice in that situation. He can't just get out, walk out, go wherever he wants. He has to stay in the prison cell. But still he has a sense of choice because he doesn't want to be there. You see? In this deterministic theory, pure determinism, there's no choice at all. Everything is just going on mechanically. Actually, determinism has really no room even for consciousness. Everything is just machinery. So that's not the same as karma. Karma always has a role for free will. Now you can become more and more free in your will. You see, that's why this release of the soul from the material nature altogether, when one enters the spiritual world, that is called moksha, or liberation. And that's completely freeing the soul from the arrangements of karma entirely.
But Paramatma is absolute consciousness. Does it have absolute wisdom too?
Yes. Past, present, and
about
future.
future.
Yes, past, present, and future. It knows everything in the future. But that doesn't determine your choice. For example,
That's hard to understand.
because no, it's not so difficult. Because as I said, what rules our activities are our feelings or our tastes, what we like, what we dislike. So, if I know you, and I know your tastes, let's say, today in the cafeteria at this university, they're going to be serving at lunch chocolate ice cream. And I know that's your favorite kind of ice cream. And I know you're going to take lunch in the cafeteria. So I know, and there's not a prophecy or, mystic seeing in the future, but I know when I go in the cafeteria at lunch and I look at your plate, you're going to have a bowl of chocolate ice cream on your plate. Now, my knowing this didn't determine your choice, you see? Because I know definitely that you're going to eat chocolate ice cream. Doesn't mean you must eat chocolate ice cream. So it's the same thing like that, the relationship between the soul and God. God knows us, so He knows how we will follow our choices. But the choices are still ours. Anything else? Well, I have a question. Was it clear enough? I was hoping someone who's studying psychology could make a comment on this, if they could follow it. It relates to anything that they have learned.
I have.
Yes?
So if one engages oneself in yogic connection with the Paramatma, then are all these things, is the jiva, or the soul, liberated also of all these aspects of the mind and the subconscious mind, the Karana Sharira?
Yes, because that is all, you see, that is existing in darkness. So when everything becomes flooded with the light of divine realization, then that light drives away the darkness. So then we see the real form of things. This is all in shadow. This is the self in shadow. Just like, you may have a very, just like you have daughters, so just suppose your daughters play a trick on you and they hide in the shadow. Maybe they stand one on another and put a big sheet over themselves that hangs to the floor, and they go in the shadow of a room somewhere, and you walk in, and then they move, and you look at them and you don't know what it is. You may become a little scared, and then they laugh. Oh, okay. So when things are a little bit hidden, a little bit in shadow, we don't see them clearly, and we can mistake them for something else. So this is the explanation of that. This is the soul, this is the self, but hidden in the shadow of ignorance. And because this shadow potency, Maya potency, is a potency of God, so also that shadow is very powerful, and it's very creative. And that's why these powerful, subtle energies are there and holding us.
But, may I continue? But to get into this significant or very important connection with the Paramatma, what is it in the individual that is it his destiny, as you mentioned, or which part of it should be triggered or changed?
Acha, okay. It's a good question. Well, that is actually in the choice, in the free will. You see, the Paramatma makes himself approachable. All over the world there are different religions, and these religions help people to become more conscious of God. Not necessarily fully conscious of God, but at least there's a start. And so then we have a choice whether to follow these teachings or not. So if one follows, then one begins to make progress. Like Krishna says in Gita, that if you take even one step on this path, then that's enough to save you from, for example, falling into lower births in the next life, you losing the chance of human existence. So, and then the more we do, particularly if we can engage in purely spiritual processes like chanting the mantras, the spiritual sounds, God's holy names and things like this. This is completely purifying the consciousness and liberating us.
But this power of choice which we have could, at least in the beginning, be used randomly, isn't it? Like suppose one is driving through a forest, let's say, and you want to reach a certain place, or you want to find something that is good, without knowing what that good is, a safe place. You suddenly come across an intersection which are giving you either left or right, and now you're left with a point where you have to choose either left or right. So there's actually a chance, probability. Does this also occur in making choices towards?
Well, I think you're talking about it's kind of mixing apples and oranges, I think, a little bit. Because our choice is never entirely just by chance. You see, when you do something, there's always a perception associated with it. There's always a sense of, I'll try this instead of that. You deliberate. Think about it a little bit. So, now, I'm not sure I follow your question so exactly, but you're relating this choice to the Paramatma. So, God is in the heart, and He knows everything about us. And so if we develop this little bit of deliberation, this little bit of interest to find out maybe there is a God, maybe I can know more. I guess that's what you're talking about, some just little inclination. Well, He is there. He knows about that immediately, and He will respond to it. So this is how it starts. There's a response.
Okay, so there's some support from somewhere.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes, certainly.
To when we make the choice.
Yes. Okay. Anything else? All right then.
If anybody is, I have just a few copies left. A few books. Vedanta Psychology is still on the print. It will come maybe after a month or 2.